Now I'd like to talk about caffeine and its positive effects on performance when used correctly. And here we are referring to both mental performance and physical performance. The exploration of caffeine as a pro-performance tool has been explored since the 1930s. At least that's some of the earliest documented literature on this. Although I have to imagine, given that people have been using caffeine for much longer than that, that long ago somebody realized that by ingesting a certain plant that they felt much more alertness and were able to hunt and gather or do any number of different things better, and as a consequence decided to consume more of that plant. Now, these days we consume a lot of caffeine in the form of coffee and tea mainly, and some people consume it in the form of caffeine tablets or energy drinks, etc. Across the board, one finds that caffeine intake at a level of 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight improves reaction time. That is, it reduces the amount of time to take a physical action or to answer a question correctly with a verbal response. It can also improve coordination. It can also improve memory, although I do want to mention that whereas most studies of the effects of caffeine on improving mental and physical performance involve taking caffeine at 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight before the mental task or physical task, there is also a pro-performance effect of caffeine on memory if one takes caffeine after learning certain material, or I should say being exposed to certain material. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. If one examines reaction time, mood, alertness, focus, and memory, or the ability to call up information from memory, or physical dexterity, power output, endurance, and overall feelings of well-being during exercise and exertion, caffeine has been shown in numerous studies in both men and women to improve all of those metrics significantly. So this is all just to say that caffeine is an incredible performance-enhancing tool. Now, what's not obvious from the statement that caffeine is a performance-enhancing tool across the board and in men and women and in different contexts is that the way in which caffeine is taken is very important. Because 90% or more of adults consume caffeine, finding controls for studies of caffeine is really challenging. That is, finding people who don't ingest caffeine regularly is a very challenging task for the researcher. And as a consequence, many of the studies of caffeine on human beings involve depriving regular caffeine users of caffeine and then examining the effects of caffeine given after a period of, say, 5 to 15 days of abstinence in a person that is essentially experiencing mild withdrawal symptoms because they haven't had the caffeine that they were used to getting. So this is an important point, and it's a point that likely exacerbates the observed pro-performance effects of caffeine. Now, all of that isn't necessarily a problem, provided you keep it in mind. And it actually points to a way in which, even if you're a regular caffeine user, you can extract more of the benefits of caffeine. The simplest way to do this, for instance, is to look back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the need to have most of your cortisol increase restricted to the hour or hours just after waking in terms of mood and alertness and performance. One of the ways to increase the peak of that cortisol early in the day is to consume caffeine shortly after that peak occurs. And this was really nicely demonstrated in a study entitled Caffeine Stimulation of Cortisol Secretion Across the Waking Hours in Relation to Caffeine Intake Levels. We will provide a link to this study. It's a somewhat complicated study because they looked at a bunch of different times of day for caffeine intake. And I should mention, in this study, they used this 300 milligrams per day or 600 milligrams per day. So that's quite high, although for people of sufficient body weight and who are accustomed to taking caffeine, it's certainly not going to be in excess of what a lot of people out there are taking. But basically what they observed was the following. Cortisol responses to caffeine are reduced but not eliminated in people who consume caffeine on a daily basis. What this means is that if you wake up and, as I recommended earlier, you avoid drinking caffeine for the first 90 to 120 minutes after waking, but you do get some sunlight or other bright light in your eyes in that time, maybe even get some exercise in that time, which would be even better. and then you ingest caffeine, you'll get a further increase in cortisol, which, provided it's restricted to the early part of the day, is a good thing overall for mood and alertness. So this is a simple performance-enhancing tool, which is to stack caffeine on the tail of that early cortisol peak. I should also mention, however, that in this study, they had people do a 5-day caffeine abstinence prior to being tested with 300 milligrams or 600 milligrams of caffeine. So the simple tool to extract from this and other studies like it is that if you want to experience the maximum alertness promoting effects of caffeine when you ingest it early in the day, you would abstain from caffeine for 5 days and then ingest caffeine 90 to 120 minutes after waking. I would still hope that you were doing all the other things that I described, morning sunlight, exercise, etc., correctly. But regardless, it's very clear that a 5-day abstinence from caffeine, however painful that might be, will increase the performance-enhancing effects of caffeine when you take caffeine on that 6th day. Now, I'm sure many of you out there are saying, why would I ever want to abstain from caffeine for 5 days in order to just get this 6-day performance-enhancing effect? Well, there are a couple reasons for doing that. Perhaps you're planning to travel to a new time zone and you want to use caffeine as a stimulant to stay up during the day in the new time zone. That's a somewhat unusual case. Others of you might be interested in the pro-physical performance effects of caffeine. We'll talk more about these in a little bit, but you want to get the maximum strength increase or the maximum endurance increase from ingesting, in this case, 300 to 600 milligrams of caffeine. Well, in that case, abstaining from caffeine for 5 days will greatly exacerbate the pro-performance effects of caffeine when you take it on that 6th day. Although, admittedly, those 5 days are likely to be pretty painful if you're a regular caffeine user. Another variation on this, however, might be to halve the amount of caffeine that you ingest on a daily basis and then go back to your regular level of caffeine intake on that day in which you need the caffeine to really boost your mood, energy, and performance. Another reason why you might want to abstain from caffeine or reduce your caffeine intake for a period of time and then go back to your regular caffeine intake is simply to identify how much of an effect caffeine is really having on your overall level of daily functioning and mood. This was something that was actually covered in beautiful detail in a book by Michael Pollan, all about caffeine. It's available on Audible. I really enjoyed that book. It describes his experience with the decision to completely abstain from caffeine for a period of months. Although I confess that after hearing that book, what it basically made me want to do is never quit drinking caffeine, because it sounded as if, at least my interpretation was, that even after several weeks or months of abstaining from caffeine, that he still fantasized about the effects of caffeine. But he did mention that when returning to ingesting caffeine after a period of long abstinence, that it had almost a, let's not call it a psychedelic property, but it had such obvious effects on mood and alertness and feelings of well-being that it really highlighted for him the extent to which caffeine normally was allowing him to just function what he thought was normally. So in other words, many of us don't even really know what our normal basal level of cognitive and physical functioning is because we're ingesting caffeine on such a regular basis. I confess that as much as I enjoyed that book and as intriguing as his description of caffeine abstinence and then the return to caffeine was, I don't intend to ever find out personally. Now, a very good reason why you might want to abstain from caffeine for a deliberate period of time and then return to caffeine intake is for its physical performance enhancing effects. And here we can look to a really interesting study, title of which is Time Course of Tolerance to the Performance Effects of Caffeine. And what I like about this study is that while, yes, it does say that abstaining from caffeine and then returning to caffeine intake can enhance physical performance in a very specific way, it also says that if you take caffeine regularly, you can still see the physical performance enhancing effects of caffeine, although they are not quite as robust as they would be had you abstained from caffeine. The design of the study is pretty straightforward. They had people either ingest 3 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine for 20 consecutive days. Many people are already doing that, I realize, but they had people do that or ensure that they were doing that, or others ingested a placebo for 20 days, so they abstained from caffeine without realizing it. Then, after that 20 days of either ingesting caffeine or a placebo, their peak performance was measured in terms of aerobic output, but prior to that measurement, they had caffeine. Okay, so it's 20 days of caffeine, and then a 21st day of caffeine, and then the physical task on that 21st day. or it's 20 days of abstinence from caffeine, and then on day 21 you get caffeine and you get the same physical test. And what they discovered was that the ingestion of caffeine increased peak performance in this aerobic output dramatically if people had abstained from caffeine. But for people that had consumed caffeine all the way through up until that day, it still was effective to ingest caffeine on day 21, but not as effective as it would have been had they abstained. And in fact, the magnitude of the what they call ergogenic effect, which is the pro-performance enhancing effect of caffeine, was higher on the first day than in subsequent days when they allowed people to continue caffeine intake. So the takeaway from this study is really straightforward. If you want to get the maximum physical performance enhancing effects of caffeine, you abstain from caffeine for 20 days. Then on day 21, when you're going to do the physical thing, the task, you ingest caffeine about 30 minutes to an hour before you do that physical challenge. Now, 20 days of abstinence is going to be rough for a lot of people. I certainly don't want to sign up for this study. In which case, you might want to do 5 days of abstinence, as we talked about before. And then on day 6 is the day that you ingest caffeine and do the physical task. There are even some studies showing that you can abstain from caffeine for just 2 days, for just 48 hours. And in particular, if you are a regular user of caffeine, this allows you to, on day 3, ingest caffeine at the dose that's appropriate for you and do the physical, or I should mention, mental performance task, and perform significantly better than those that have been taking caffeine throughout the entire period leading up to the challenge. So you don't necessarily need to abstain for 20 days in order to get the pro-performance effects of caffeine on day 21. You could do 5 days of abstinence prior, or even 2 days of abstinence prior. Or if that's intolerable to you, as it is in my mind to me, to just reduce your caffeine intake slightly, or even perhaps halve it, if you can tolerate that, in the week or 2 weeks, or maybe even 3 weeks preceding some physical or mental challenge. Now, again, this sort of implies that you're going up against a marathon, or you're going up against a series of long tests, maybe standardized tests in one day. There, I just really want to point out that there is an abundant literature showing that people perform best on mental tests if they are in the state that they were when they studied for that material. Now, in college, I knew a number of people who took this to the extreme, thinking that if they were to study under the effects of alcohol, that they would be best off consuming alcohol prior to taking exams, and it turns out to not be the case. Here we're talking in particular about psychostimulant effects of caffeine and other compounds. So don't think that you can drink or be under the influence of THC and then when you study and then take an exam under the same influence and do just as well as you would had you not ingested anything. Please don't let that be the takeaway. However, do let it be the takeaway that caffeine's effects are made more potent by a brief to not so brief period of abstinence prior to taking a dosage of caffeine. And then the final point to make is that if you are somebody who is not accustomed to drinking caffeine, meaning you're hypersensitive to caffeine or you don't regularly ingest caffeine, please do not ingest caffeine on the day of any important mental or physical challenge or performance, because what you will find is that because you are not caffeine adapted, you will experience changes in your thermal regulation, in your levels of anxiety and jitteriness, and your levels of focus that could be very detrimental to mental or physical performance. So you don't want to throw yourself in the deep end by ingesting caffeine if you're not used to it. And I should mention that for people that are not accustomed to ingesting caffeine or are very sensitive to caffeine, even 25 to 50 milligrams of caffeine, again, the amount that's found in, for instance, a piece of certain types of chocolate, can actually cause anxiety. So be careful there. Here I'm referring only to people that are accustomed with caffeine intake. So what I recommend is to explore the ergogenic effects of caffeine during your training, and then to make a decision about what you can reasonably and reliably do in terms of abstinence, and then pulse with caffeine on the day of the challenge.